There are a few stories in the gospel where someone approaches Jesus, and the interaction between Jesus and this person is one of just total humility. And some of them, when I'm reading, if there's no deacon and I happen to be reading the gospel, it takes all my being not to burst out in tears.
Hello and welcome to Chat CTK, a new podcast exploring life and faith at Christ the King Catholic Church in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm your host, John Stotts, Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Christ the King. In our fourth episode, I'm back for another insightful conversation with our pastor, Father Dexter Brewer. Our focus this week is on the upcoming Sunday Gospel, a startling passage in which Jesus resists a woman's plea for her daughter's healing. We'll be diving into discussions about Jesus' understanding of his mission, the essence of law, and the importance of a God who puts people before precepts. So thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely.
Been able to attend Mass when you've been presiding the last couple of weeks. And we've had a difficult series of readings from Matthew that often raise a lot of questions, but seem to defy easy answers or sort of clear points. You said something last Sunday, it was the story of Jesus walking on the water and Peter's failure to do so, about being in a position of authority as priest and pastor, but also having the experience of not always having power, of not always having answers, even when such a position would seem to demand that you be well-versed in both answers to deep questions that we have and the power to make our problems go away. Is that a fair summary of what you had said?
Well, the reading, it was difficult because it is a difficult reading because that scene of Jesus walking in water and Peter being called to him and walking a bit failing, and others in the gospel, at the end of scenes like that, there's a suggestion that if Peter had faith, or if one of the other disciples had faith, they could heal a demon, they could do these things, but it's because of kind of a lack of faith that they are unable to do certain things. And as I reflected on that, I thought about myself. As priests, we should be anyway people of faith and prayer, and yet there's so many things I can't do. I so many things I don't know. I mean, and if it comes with faith, or if it should, I would like to believe that I have a little more than a little bit of faith, and yet I'm unable to do any of the things that the gospel speaks about. And so I mentioned at the homily that in my 34 years of priesthood, almost every time I go into a hospital room, to anoint someone in their homes or wherever it happens to be, I ask for whatever faith is needed, that at least in this instance, they might be raised up, And I know that's not the purpose of the sacrament. The sacrament is about the church's presence and about Christ being present and accompanying a person, which happens whether I can see it or not. But still, there is that something that says, if I'm praying for this person to be raised up and to be healed, surely if I were the priest that the gospel speaks about, Jesus speaks to his disciples and all, surely this would happen, and so it can be a little frustrating or daunting.
It's a bit of a conundrum. If you're a person of faith and you ask for these things, then we'd assume that you would get the things you asked for, unless God, of course, does not want you to have them. But then we're left wondering, why do we have all these stories of faith and healing when that doesn't appear to be what God has in store for us?
After one of the daily masses, we had a reading where a man brought his son to Jesus who was possessed, I believe, and And he mentioned that he had brought him first to the disciples, and the disciples couldn't do anything for him. And Jesus heals the guy. And afterwards, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, well, why couldn't we do that? And Jesus says, in Matthew anyway, he says, because of your little faith, And then he says, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, be uprooted and planted into the sea, and it would do so. Or to this mountain, move, and it would. And so I asked people who were at Mass that day, how many of you have been able to move a tree? And these are faithful people. I mean, there's something, there's at least a mustard seed there, if you can quantify faith that way. I don't think it can be, but they're there because they believe that Christ makes himself present to us when we gather in the community. We hear his voice in the gospel. The Spirit is working and moving in that space in a way that it doesn't in other places, because of our gathering. And so they believe those things, and yet not one of them had moved a tree or made a mountain move from one place to another. So,
well, in this Sunday's gospel, we get another story of faith. And I think it's another story that raises more questions than it answers, both about what faith is, but in this case, about who Jesus is and how he understands himself and how he interacts with people, how we are meant to interact with him. So maybe you'll read it and we can talk a bit about it.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
But I'd like to make one point because it's something that I continue to think about. It was kind of the end point of last week's homily, and that is, after meditating for quite a while on Peter's inability to walk on water, and all the comments about how, maybe the reason why he couldn't was because he took his eyes off Jesus, because, whatever the reasons are. In the end, the thing that I'm kind of turning over in my mind these days is maybe, just maybe, it's not necessary that we be able to walk on water. And I think that's how I ended the homily. That maybe it's enough to know that there's someone who can, God, and to know that he's close by, So all this fighting with faith and trying to do extraordinary things, maybe we can leave that to God,
Yeah.
And so this is a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. At that time, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and behold, a Canaanite woman of that district came and called out, have pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon. But Jesus did not say a word in answer to her. Jesus' disciples came and asked him, send her away, for she keeps calling out after us. He said in reply, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But the woman came and did Jesus homage, saying, Lord, help me. He said in reply, it is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. She said, please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters. Then Jesus said to her in reply, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. And the woman's daughter was healed from that hour. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
There are a few stories in the Gospel where someone approaches Jesus, and the interaction between Jesus and this person is one of just total humility. There's the one, and some of them when I'm reading, if there's no deacon and I happen to be reading the Gospel, it takes all my being not to burst out in tears. There's the one where Jesus asked the guy, what do you want me to do for you? And he says, Master, I would like to see. I think it's Bartimaeus, maybe. It's just a very simple request. I can't see. I know you can do this. And if you would, I'd like. And then there's one where, very similar, the guy approaches Jesus and he says, if you want to, you could help me. You could heal me. And Jesus said, I want to, I mean, it's just, and then, the 10 lepers, where the one guy returns and says, I don't believe you did this. I'm a nobody. So this is one of them too, at least as I read it, where the humility is profound. And I guess humility and faith go together. When you're in the face of the Lord of the universe,
humility, faith, and a certain persistence. For me, the story takes a very human situation, a situation in which I think we've all found ourselves, that of really needing something and knowing that there's someone else who could get it for you and being utterly ignored. Whether it's waiting in line and being dismissed by someone who could help us, or contexts where we know that if someone just bent a little rule and helped us out and it wouldn't hurt anyone, and it's just sort of procedure or bureaucracy or whatever that's keeping us from getting what we need, and the feeling when we think this person is not going to, they could help me.
Right.
They're not going to do it.
Right.
And sort of, as I hear this, picturing it from this woman's perspective, this sort of building desperation and frustration, but somehow she's able to transmute that into a skillful way of getting Jesus to do what she needs him to do for her to have the life that she thinks, or not even her life, but for her daughter.
Right. Which is even more intense.
Right.
I mean, it's
right.
one thing to be asking for something for yourself.
Right.
But a parent asking for a child.
Right.
Is on another level completely.
Right. I mean, in this context, I think of the difficulty for some people to get the medications that they need, or to get the medications that their children, and when they're, they can't get their doctor to answer the phone, or they've run out of, and there are all these layers and restrictions that often have very good reasons for being there.
There's a movie. What's the movie where the guy, he's trying to get health care for his son, and he then takes these hostages or something because, anyway, I've never seen the movie either, but I do know that a father trying to get his son the help that he needs.
Right.
There are all kinds of governmental and other barriers and obstacles to achieving what he wants, and he just goes nuts.
Right.
Because he can't get for his son what he needs.
Right.
And in this case too, there are. I mean, because Jesus points out at the beginning, I didn't come for you.
Right.
I mean, you can't say it any more clearly. I'm here for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and so that's a pretty big barrier.
And we're kind of working our way backwards through this, but there's the parallelism. Jesus tells her, the first thing he says to her, it's not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. And if he's the one saying this about children, that puts him in the position of parent, right? And in the way, so he's come to help his children, and here she is advocating for her child, and he's saying, I'm doing this for my children.
Right. And she's saying,
and your children are not my children, but somehow she is able to appeal to him on the sort of parental level, this desperation, if, see how desperate I am for my child. Is there not something of that in you?
I think that's a great point,
And that it reaches him somehow. Because I think we have no reason not to believe him, not to take this. We talked a little about this in our, before the recording.
It's curious because, as you say that, he brings up this relationship between parent and child, right? Mm-hmm. And she simply, I think, not expressly, but she uses it.
Yes.
So you brought it up. Okay, just as you then, take care or feed properly, your kids, those who you're responsible for, I also have the same responsibility for my child, and therefore, what's your response to that? And it's really not something he can ignore.
Right.
Right. It reminds me of those cases in court where one lawyer brings up something, kind of an avenue of a way of seeing something, and then when the other lawyer tries to go down that same road. The one lawyer objects, and the judge says, "No, you started this.
Yeah, you opened the door.
Right, that's right. You started this. He gets to go as far down this road as he wants.
Right.
And so she takes advantage of the image that he creates. And,
right. And in a way, she matches him stubbornness for stubbornness. We don't always, I think, focus on the amount of tenacity that it required for Jesus to do his ministry, to stick to this plan. There were how many different distractions or side alleys or things that he could have done. I mean, lots of wine. He could make lots of wine, lots of things to do. And yet, he sticks to his understanding of this mission, which will take him to the grave and beyond. And yet here he is bested by someone who is just as stubborn in what she thinks her mission is, in this case, to secure healing for her daughter. And he caves. He gives into it. And especially, in this context, in an honor-shame society, social standing was everything. His ability to preach, to gain the confidence of the crowd, had to do with his, sort of mastery of the situation. And, this particular person had, not just one or two, but 3 strikes against her. She was from a region outside of Jesus's own, a region that, Matthew points out, she's a Canaanite, the historic enemies of Israel. She's a woman. And her daughter's possessed by a demon, which, doesn't happen randomly. No one in this time would think, you could walk down the street and get accidentally possessed. You were possessed by doing, or thought to become possessed by doing forbidden things, or it was a mark that God had abandoned you. And so here's someone at the very bottom of social standing, when it came to Jesus and his disciples, and he allows her to be correct. He sees her point and lets go of his own understanding, of his own stubborn clinging to something that he thinks is very important and very good. And
so there are some who, who have said in reading this, and some have commented that maybe Jesus was kind of toying with her. That in fact he never had any notion that his ministry was so limited, and that he was kind of testing her to see just how far she'd go and how persistent she'd be. What do you think of that? And they say that because it's difficult to imagine that Jesus would be limited by anything, even by ministry, because of the nature of the all-embracing, nature of the gospel, And so I think they're trying to find a way to make this go away.
I think the right instinct in that, the right instinct in that is to recognize that, in what I think Catholics have traditionally called God's providence, that there is a way in which all things will work together for the good of those who love God, as Paul says. That is, as life unfolds, God does have a way of sort of anticipating everything and moving things to come together well in the end, we hope. And so in knowing this, I think we tend to put that on Jesus, where I think the error is that Jesus gives plenty of indications in all 4 Gospels that he doesn't fully know the plan, that things happen. He has to anticipate people's faith. When there is no faith, he can't do certain things. So I think that perspective would turn Jesus into someone who's maybe more manipulative than I'm comfortable with, someone who is misusing his power to score points. It solves some problems, but I think it creates others. And the one that it creates for me is I don't know how to relate to this person. This person is someone who has all the power and all the answers, and I have to do a song and dance to unlock, the right mystery. And in this interaction, it takes away the humanness of it.
Right. I would agree. Right.
It turns it into a power play, and it turns this woman's suffering into a spectacle, for us to learn from, so that she's supposed to thank her lucky stars that Jesus played this game and taught her something. But here, I think it's more raw. I think Jesus actually is reluctant, unwilling, and I think she changes his mind.
And there is at least one place, though at the moment I forget where it is, where he, in sending his disciples out, he tells them, he kind of limits their ministry. He says, "You're to go first to the lost house of Israel.
Yeah.
Don't go into Samaritan villages or any of those places, but go to these people." So at least in that reading, it sounds as if, and it sounds wise. You can't go everywhere all at once. You first tend to your own household,
Right.
and then you expand it beyond that. But there does seem to be a sense that he has some notions of the limitations of what he himself can do and what he wants his disciples to do.
Right.
Though, I guess in this case, he kind of goes beyond those boundaries.
And at the root of that is her love for her daughter. And I think we can't lose sight of that it draws her love up into this feverish pitch of, I will do anything.
Yeah.
And that, and sort of allowing that to be written down. And now it's a story we tell. I think that tells us something of God's own love. That is, it's not just Jesus here who tells us what God is like. Jesus' interaction with this woman creates a situation in which we get to learn about God from, the poor woman with a possessed daughter who is willing to argue with God about what she needs. And if God is just as, stubborn and bringing about our healing as this woman is, then we're okay. And that, I think, brings us back to where you started, which is maybe it's not important that we walk on water, because this woman can't heal her daughter with her faith. Her faith allows her to be stubborn enough to not let go, and to continue to advocate for her daughter and to do whatever it takes to get it from the guy who has what she needs.
That's right. So she knows that someone else can.
Right.
It's not important that she can.
Right.
And that he's close by.
Right. So she seems to succeed where Peter fails. Peter wants to use his faith to walk on water. This woman uses her faith to recognize
that he's here. Right.
Yeah. So what do you make then, if Jesus does have a mission? If we take his words at face value and he has an understanding of what he's supposed to do, that in some sense he thinks is given by God, that I don't think it's idle that he says no. I think he maybe sees some risk in what he's done. Nevertheless, he does break his own rules. What do you make of that? Do you think he sinned? Do you think he violated his his vows, or his
cross that one off?
Yeah.
No, but I do believe that there is first, there's a benefit to law and order, or to limits, in our lives. For example, I think I mentioned, if you were beginning anything, a good plan must recognize that at least initially you need to be fairly limited in what you want to accomplish. If you were to accomplish anything at all, and if it is to grow, but you must focus a bit. And so I think his ministry is focused quite rightly. But what is extraordinary is that when the moment comes when he needs to violate the walls that kind of keep him in this focus or whatever, that he's willing to do that in this case. In the church, we would call it dispensing from the law that's there.
Yes.
Which we do all the time. We have all kinds of laws, as people know, books and books of laws, but the church is willing to dispense with most of them. There are only a few of them that can't be dispensed, and some of them it dispenses all the time, and yet it still keeps the law, because there's something to be said for the order that comes from something being known. And people knowing what is expected of them. Do you know what I mean?
It's interesting. It's a different conception of law than I think sometimes we have. If I understand you right, the law teaches us something. It tells us something about a pattern or some regularly occurring thing. But if that's the primary function of the law, it can be dispensed with because it still continues to teach us, even if we found an exception to it.
That's right. That's right.
But that means the law, the primary function, is not just to utterly dictate everything that we're supposed to do all the time, which I think sometimes we think about it. The law simply tells us what to do.
Or to keep people imprisoned or somehow
Right.
encased in something, right?
Right.
No, that's not the purpose of it.
Right.
At all, right.
But the law could tell us what is to be done,
Right. ...
And
our relationship with others and how those relationships are, what others can expect from us,
Right.
given our relationships to them as pastors,
Right.
as bishop, as, yeah.
Right. So on the one hand, you could imagine a Jesus who has no law, has no mission. He just pops into the world and is there and goes about healing people and then, but what we would lose is, I think, first of all, his aim to develop, not just to heal individuals, but to develop a community of people in whom, healing and hope and these things are sort of alive and vibrant. If he just goes and solves everyone's problems, individuals would be healed, but there would be no church. There would be no community. And so he needs a mission to gather people to himself who he can talk to. And given that he probably only spoke one or two languages,
all those things are limiting. I mean, even
Right.
the fact that he's born in a particular part of the world and he can't be everywhere.
Right.
So he's having to attend to where he is, who's before him. And the fact is his community happens to be the lost people of the house of Israel.
Right.
That expands, but initially he's limited by so many things.
Right.
I mean, human beings are limited. That's
Right.
kind of the way it is.
Right.
I mean, even human beings who happen to be God.
And he didn't incarnate in China.
Right.
He didn't
Right.
incarnate
in the United States.
Peru. Right. So he is limited by location, by language. He also didn't incarnate as the son of a Roman emperor.
Right.
He did not, which would have given him more access to people, what laws he could have made, what armies he could have led. But instead, he becomes the most limited, in some ways that a human could be, both in locale, this nondescript region of Galilee, and at a time when, the Jewish people were relatively powerless, politically speaking. And that's where he chooses to sort of make his beginning, and to formulate a mission that would help him to gradually sort of leaven the dough of the world. On the other hand, we could imagine a Jesus who is utterly bound to his law, utterly bound to his vision, who admits no exceptions. What would be lost there if we had a Jesus who is unwilling to make exceptions, unwilling to dispense?
Well, when the law becomes an end in itself, then of course you've got a real problem.
Right.
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 I mean, it is said over and over in Scripture that the law and even something like the Sabbath, all those things were made for us, and so the law has to be kept in proper balance. I mean, its purpose. It's one of the unique things about the canon law, as it's compared, I think, to the civil law. The canon law really is. It's grounded in theology first, but it's also, its purpose is the salvation of the people of the community. So the object of everything that we do, has to keep that in mind. And if you lose sight of that and just begin to issue decrees and enforce decrees just because of the decree's sake, then then it doesn't work. I mean, it loses its power, really.
Right.
Okay. Which is why Rome. It's curious. They often when we send cases to them, you'll think, okay, this will be their response. They're often very, very the response that they send is something that you could never imagine, because they have a different understanding of how the law works, and especially about how it is to form the community and the people, which they always keep in mind. And
as a parent, when I think about making rules, I break the rules I make all the time. And my kids know that. I'm such a soft touch. I will, with firmness, lay forth this rule. It's meant to protect, how much screen time they should have, or when dessert should be, and it all makes sense, and it's all reasonable. And yet, sometimes they just say, "Papa, please," and okay, I can't think of a good reason right now not to right. Other than for the sake of the
laws.
Yes,
right.
It's against the rules. And I worry about that sometimes. Kids need structure, but also they need to see that we're all making this up as we go along. Even canon law can be changed, right?
The Pope has changed it recently. So,
right. And so back to your point, we need structure, and we develop structure in accordance with how we understand the world to be, but then sometimes some persistent issue that won't go away will demand that we make exceptions, and eventually, in the history of Christianity, this exception will prove to be the rule. That the mission will extend, not in Jesus's lifetime, but it will extend to these other areas, and so we get even a foretaste of this. As Jesus realizes that it's already happening, beyond his control. This woman has already been led by the Spirit to him, and manages to surprise him. Well, thanks for joining us again. Any final thoughts?
None, but thanks for having me.
Good. Thanks for listening to Chat CTK, a new podcast exploring life and faith at Christ the King Catholic Church. Future episodes will feature interviews with CTK parishioners, staff, and clergy about their experiences of God, Catholicism, and faith in everyday life. You can find new episodes at ctk.org/chatctk, or you can subscribe to this podcast using Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app.